been but 4 years since I've been here, and since 2007, and so a lot has happened both personally and professionally. As Steve said, I was busy chasing after twin girls, and my son started kindergarten, and it's been a whirlwind professionally in terms of our work on the ground at the ACLU here in Arizona, really challenging some of the most extremist policies, public policies that we have seen in the country. Our national, my national colleagues at the ACLU affectionately, I don't know if it's affectionately or not, but they call Arizona the heart of darkness state, and for very good reason. It makes me very sad as somebody who's raising children here, and I'm sure many of you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the work we've been doing and really how we've stepped up in recent years to respond to some of these really problematic public policies that we believe violate our fundamental freedoms. The ACLU over the past few years has had to hire more litigators. We have a full-time lobbyist now at the legislature, really expand our legal program to step up and fight some of these proposals in court. And so, but before I get into that, I just want to kind of step back a little bit, and one of the reasons, talk a little bit about why I do the work that I do. You know, I moved here now 5 years ago, and I packed up my family and my things and moved across country from Florida, and one of the reasons I moved here was because it has a large Latino, Arizona has a very, very large Latino population, and it reminded me in a lot of ways of where I grew up in Miami, Florida, and there's wonderful Spanish-speaking neighborhoods where you can find everything from Mexican choripan to Argentine, Mexican tortas to Argentine choripan, and it's really what makes this state so wonderful. We have a wonderful, rich history of being welcoming, and obviously a lot of that has changed in recent years. I never, in my wildest dreams, never imagined that Arizona would adopt as part of its official policy a policy of attrition through enforcement. That is a policy that is outlined in the first section of SB 1070, and the goal of attrition through enforcement is to make life so inhospitable for thousands and thousands of people in this state that they simply self-deport, that they leave the state of Arizona, abandoning their homes, abandoning their jobs, and abandoning their families. And that's exactly what has happened. The ACLU believes that that SB 1070 was bad for Arizona for a host of reasons, including the fact that it was flawed from a legal and from a policy matter. But I think more importantly, from an economic development standpoint, we have it hurt Arizona at a time when we could really least afford it. And I just want to give you some stats about the real impact of SB 1070. The Center for American Progress estimates that $141 million in spending and $9.4 million in taxes were lost because of canceled conferences after SB 1070 was passed. And even more conservative estimates from the Arizona Hotel and Lodging Association report $15 million worth of conferences canceled in the 4 months after Governor Brewer signed the law. SB 1070 led to thousands of families abandoning their homes, increasing foreclosure rates. In some school districts, we saw almost a 30% decline in the enrollment of Latino students. It caused retailers that cater to Latinos to their revenue to fall by about 50%. And so yes, the most dangerous provisions of SB 1070 were blocked from ever going into effect, but I think the damage to the community was very, very real, and it really did devastate our communities. But I think I want to kind of take a little step back and just talk a little bit about why the ACLU stepped up to challenge this piece of legislation. I think regardless of how you feel about immigration, I think we now can acknowledge that SB 1070 really had very little to do with border security. In fact, our governor acknowledged that. Many of the moderate Republicans who voted for this piece of legislation admitted that on the floor. SB 1070 was about giving police unprecedented authority to stop and question people, not based on criminal wrongdoing, but on their perceived immigration status, on things like their accent, skin color. These were basically what was happening. It was, we believe, and we saw this in terms of the real impact on the ground, was that it invited racial profiling by police. So we filed a lawsuit in May of 2010 on behalf of 24 clients, including many, many US citizens who were pulled over and asked to show their papers. This was even before the law was scheduled to go into effect. Right after Governor Brewer signed it, many of our clients were pulled over and they were stopped. People like Jim and Marion Shi. Jim is of Latino and Chinese descent. His wife, Marion, is a Japanese-American who was interned in an internment camp in Texas after World War II when she was a child. They are very active in Latino-Asian politics in the Valley, and they're small business owners, and they were pulled over twice and asked to show their papers. These are people who have never been convicted of any crimes, and these are people who were directly affected by SB 1070. Some of our other clients include people, victims of domestic violence, victims, immigrants who fled war-torn countries to come to the United States to seek political asylum, people who have permission from the federal government to be in this country but who didn't have the appropriate documentation. And so these were the real harms, the real impact of SB 1070, and we were able to use these case examples to convince Judge Bolton to enjoin some of the most dangerous provisions of the law. Our lawsuit is the largest, it's the most comprehensive lawsuit that was filed, and as a result of that litigation, the judge actually ruled that, that the SB 1070 will have a, I'm going to quote from one of her decisions. She basically said it imposes an unacceptable burden on both citizens and non-citizens alike. And she also ruled that race was a motivating factor in the passage of SB 1070, which I think is very, very important, because in order to put it into context, when we talk about why SB 1070 passed at that time in Arizona, it was really, you know, the confluence of lots of forces. We were, housing bubble had burst, high unemployment. We saw in economy, and this is throughout our history, is that when the economy goes sour, we turn our anger to some of the most vulnerable, disenfranchised populations, and that includes immigrants. And that is exactly what happened. We actually used a lot of the statements that were made by Senator Pierce, by the sponsors of the bill, basically attacking Mexicans, and we used that in our litigation, and the judge ultimately used that to rule that in fact the bill was motivated by discrimination against immigrants and perceived immigrants. And the reality in Arizona is that the impact, many of the people who were impacted were US citizens of Latino descent. And so our work against intolerance and state-sponsored discrimination really stems back from the beginning of our history. In the 1920s, when we were founded, we actually defended and represented European immigrants who at the time were being deported for having radical views. And so one of our first very cases early on was on behalf of immigrants, at that time, European immigrants. And so although there's been a lot of, throughout our history, the high-profile, sexy cases that many may not agree with. For example, we all know in 1977 that the ACLU defended the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie. And yes, I mean, we defend racist speech, and we did that in 1977, but we have a very long history as being one of the predominantly white organizations that very early on stood up for the rights of immigrants, for racial justice issues. And we were the only organization after World War II to challenge the internment of people of Japanese descent after World War II in internment camps. We called this an act of racism and war hysteria. We have, throughout our history, challenged housing discrimination and police practices that disproportionately target both immigrants and other people of color. And so this our work around SB 1070 really is not new, and it extends from decades of working on behalf of immigrants and other people of color. And unfortunately, throughout our history, it's a shameless history, and many times immigrants are the first targets of many of these public policies. And I think what I'm most proud of, having worked for the ACLU, especially working for the ACLU now in Arizona, is that we have stood up to these principles that ensure that everyone deserves the protection of the U.S. Constitution and that everyone deserves equal rights under the U.S. Constitution, regardless of what the polls show. I mean, I think it's, we all know that SB 1070 was very, very supported across the board in Arizona, and copycat measures are also being supported and introduced in other parts of the country. And so I think that you know, our work does not revolve around polls, and we stick to our principles and the Constitution. And the Constitution basically says that everyone is entitled to protections. And so I want to talk a little bit about, Steve asked me to talk a little bit about our litigation. And you know, one of the primary ways and one of the most effective ways that we have found to change these bad public policies and right wrongs is through litigation, and we're known as litigators. That's what we do well. It is one of our strengths. We appear before the U.S. Supreme Court more than any organization other than the U.S. Department of Justice itself, and so we have found that it is a tactic that works. And it works at challenging abuses of power and also correcting and forcing government to change their policies and do the right thing. So for example, when Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio failed to maintain safe and humane conditions for the 7,000 pretrial detainees in his jail, we sued. And we got a court order from a federal district court judge that said you have a constitutional obligation to provide basic human services, basic mental health, basic medical services, nutrition, to eliminate overcrowding, and that's what he was forced to do. And clearly Arpaio is not something he would have done it out of the goodness of his own heart, and so he was forced to do that by this federal court order. And that's one of the cases that we are involved with in terms of challenging practices by Arpaio. It's one of 7 cases that we currently have against the sheriff, so he keeps us pretty busy. These past few years, we are challenging not just issues related to conditions of confinement, but issues related to the denial of access to reproductive health care. He has a policy of not transporting women in his facilities who are seeking abortions. We've been fighting that and have won, you know, a lot of it depends on his mood in the day in terms of whether or not he's going to abide by that court order. We are challenging issues related to discrimination against Muslims, and of course the racial profiling of Latinos, U.S. citizens, as part of these immigration enforcement efforts by the sheriff. Just this fall, we appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court. 2 out of the 3 Arizona cases that were argued in the U.S. Supreme Court were argued by the ACLU. And just the fact that 3 cases from Arizona were argued before the U.S. Supreme Court just demonstrates just how really we're moving in the wrong direction. Some of those cases, one of the cases includes a challenge to the state's tuition tax credit program. The program has been operating for years and transfers millions and millions of dollars from public coffers from the state treasury into the coffers of private sectarian organizations. And so we are challenging that as a violation of the First Amendment. And we got a great decision out of the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit found that that program actually discriminates against individuals, especially students, on the basis of religion. And so it was a great decision, and we did not want it to get up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the state appealed that decision, and so that's where we were arguing that case in November. We are also challenging the state's employer sanctions law, a law that, although it was intended to target businesses, has been used to arrest workers, and we are representing the workers, and we are arguing that many of the workers who were legally authorized to work in this state have been disproportionately impacted by the law. People who have been naturalized are, unfortunately, have